I've always been fascinated by Mascot horror games. The idea of taking something that was initially meant for children and then twisting it to a disturbing version of its past self is a truly compelling process that can provide insights into how even the most innocent of creations can hide something sinister inside, and you just need the right approach in order to bring it to the surface. Ever since the release of the first Five Nights at Freddy's game back in 2014, we have been inundated by a legion of titles that tried and continue to try to reach even a fraction of the unprecedented success that the FNAF series ended up achieving, but it's only been a select few of them that have managed to stand out from the crowd and establish their own identity. While games like Playtime, Bendy and the Ink Machine, Tattletale, Amanda the Adventurer, My Friendly Neighborhood, Indigo Park, and even the admittedly mediocre Garden of Banban have cemented themselves as popular entries in the genre, with many of them boasting multiple episodes, there have been numerous others that never made it past obscurity. Titles such as Sparky Marky, Circus of Tim Tim, Playtown, The Joycare, and Boki are just a few of the Mascot horror contenders that didn't manage to leave a mark. And while some may argue that they owe their failure to subpar gameplay mechanics, I'd like to offer the counter-argument that gameplay is not necessarily the defining factor in whether these games will find success or not. If you really think about it, most of the aforementioned popular titles are fairly simple in their approach to gameplay. For example, Bendy and the Ink Machine, Tattletale, the first chapter of Playtime, and Indigo Park are essentially glorified walking simulators with occasional stealth, puzzle, and clunky combat elements as well as some chase sequences. And the original Five Nights at Freddy's games didn't even feature any walking, with you being stuck in a room while watching for enemy activity through cameras as well as having to monitor energy levels to keep the lights on, so while gameplay wasn't atrocious, it's not like we were offered any exciting mechanics that kept us hooked on our screens. Now, this is not a video meant to criticize any of the games referenced up until this point. Instead, what I want to do is explore what makes for a compelling Mascot horror game by identifying the common elements amongst the most standout titles in the genre and effectively shedding light on the patterns that lead to their popularity. It goes without saying that this is not a scientific study, but rather the result of my love for the genre, which has led to certain personal observations when it comes to the why I have enjoyed some Mascot horror games but didn't enjoy others. Observations that tend to coincide with the public reception of many of these titles as well. So having said that, in my humble opinion, there are 4 different components that need to be competently present in a Mascot horror game in order to increase its chances for success by making it both scary and captivating, and those are Mascot design, time period, setting, and finally, lore. Starting with Mascot design, it goes without saying that featuring a well thought out and effectively constructed mascot is one of the most basic of hooks for a Mascot horror game, and said Mascot design has its work cut out for it because it will need to function in 2 different levels, namely standard and monstrous. If you've played a Mascot horror game in the past, you've probably noticed that in the majority of them, the mascots tend to have 2 different forms, one that is intended to be the regular look with which the mascot has been known to the public, and one that is meant to represent its true nature, which almost always tends to be nightmare fuel. Examples of this would be Freddy and Nightmare Freddy, the Huggy Wuggy before and after your first chase, as well as all the mascots in Indigo Park in terms of how you see them portrayed in the park's promotional material and what they actually look like in reality. Now, while I do consider both forms to be incredibly important, I have to say that, surprisingly, it is the regular design that needs the most attention, since it will have to evoke a very specific emotion in the player, and that emotion is nostalgia. More specifically, these mascots need to not only make us feel like we have seen them before, a long time ago during our childhood, but also that they were an important part of our entertainment during those formative years. And the reason that this sense needs to be achieved is so that an emotional connection can be formed between us and them, thus resulting in genuine horror when we realize that something that used to offer us joy now poses a threat. For example, the enemies in My Friendly Neighborhood are heavily inspired by Sesame Street and the Muppets, Five Nights at Freddy's took a lot of inspiration from the animatronics fad of the 80s and 90s, including Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater, and Indigo Park is largely influenced by Disneyland with its animal-based mascots. Here I do wish to clarify that while I understand that a good chunk of the Mascot horror fanbase is not old enough to remember or even have experienced those things, I still think that these games need to make them feel like they did in order to achieve the aforementioned emotional connection and consequently the horror birthed by corrupting it. This nostalgic element is also pertinent to our next component, namely time period. Before I expand on on this, I first need to clarify that, by that term, I do not mean the time during which the game takes place, but rather the time when the story's foundation actually started. If you really think about it, arguably the vast majority of Mascot horror games have a history that extends back to older times, usually a span that ranges from the 50s all the way to the late 90s or early 2000s. For example, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was established back in the early 80s, which was also when we had the first tragedy that marred what would become its troubled history. Playtime's Playtime Corporation was founded in 1930, with the game's inciting incident occurring in the mid-90s, and Indigo Park's titular park first opened its gates most likely sometime during the 50s before closing them in 2008. Now, why would this choice of rooting the basis of these games so far back in the past be something I consider so important in adding to their disturbing nature and eventual success? The answer is simple. Mystery. You see, placing their setting and important story elements so far back makes it all the more difficult for information on those happenings to be uncovered, since technology was much more limited during those times and mostly fell under the analog category, which is a separate genre of horror in and of itself, though I do feel it walks hand in hand with Mascot horror for the most part. From old VHS tapes that reveal grainy footage, to mysterious voice recordings and questionable documents, all the way to the occasional in-universe arcade games that hide more secrets than you might initially expect, information in these games is both scattered all over the place and hard to locate, which further adds to the enigmatic nature of these stories by essentially making each new discovery a puzzle piece that you need to figure out how to fit to the overall narrative. That being said, situating the inciting incidents of these games in the past is another way to fuel the flames of the aforementioned nostalgic aspect, with a prime example of this mentality being Indigo Park, which is clearly inspired by Disneyland, as evident by its opening cinematic, in which Isaac Indigo, its founder, gives a speech on the park's opening day that pretty much mirrors Walt Disney's own speech during the inaugural day of Disneyland, thus forming a personal thread with us by establishing a connection to one of the most prolific entertainment juggernauts that defined a lot of childhoods. This leads us to the third important Mascot horror component, which is setting. The places within which these games transpire are as important as the mascots themselves, because essentially they need to be able to hit a similar duality in appearing as both settings which were once a haven for children to have fun in, as well as the decrepit and abandoned establishments that they ended up becoming years or decades down the line. Wandering through their deceptively empty halls needs to be an exercise in creepiness but also wistfulness, making you feel both constantly uneasy due to the potential threats lurking somewhere in the dark, but also kind of nostalgic of what they once were, as your mind conjures up visions of better times, back when these buildings were full of life and operating based on their original mission of bringing joy to kids, before everything was tainted by tragedy, misery, and hubris. Walking through the entrance hall of Playtime Corporation and its gift shops, watching the abandoned halls and party-themed dining areas of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza through grainy cameras, exploring the abandoned attractions of Indigo Park and examining their old posters, all of these experiences are both unsettling since you have this perpetual feeling that something could go wrong at any given moment, but also sentimental in a weird way, because you can clearly see the promise these places once held. You can envision parents and children visiting them with wide smiles as the potential for a fun day lay ahead. You can practically smell the sweet aroma of cotton candy and the mouth-watering scent of melted cheese on pizza, and as the illusion reaches its peak, it all comes crashing down, once again revealing to you not how things should be, but how they truly are, how they ended up becoming following some mysterious tragedy that still eludes you, and it is that tragedy that forms the final and, according to a lot of people, most important component of Mascot horror games. Lore. It's no secret that deciphering the hidden history behind the events of these games is one of their most engaging aspects. Just a simple search through YouTube will reveal thousands of videos trying to piece together the fragmented narratives of titles like Five Nights at Freddy's and Playtime, with the most prominent creator willing to tackle such daunting tasks being none other than Matt Pat and his Game Theorists channel, which was practically built upon FNAF content and was actually how I got into the Mascot horror genre in the first place. topics. The fun aspect of lore hunting here is actually completely connected to my aforementioned analysis on time period and, more specifically, the technological limitations of olden times, which render the documentation of anything that happened back then a more analog experience through the necessity of VHS and voice recordings as well as handwritten testimonies, all of which fully lack the convenience provided by the existence of high-tech tools like smartphones, which would have made said documentation easier, as well as the internet, through which dissemination of those pieces of information would have been laughably easy. This analog aspect leads to the necessity of actively seeking out tapes, recorders, and notes, while also requiring keen observation of your surroundings for potential environmental details that further add to storytelling, thus making each game a complex puzzle that only the most dedicated fans will be able to fully solve. It is my firm belief that it's this hunt for the truth that has kept the Mascot horror genre fully relevant all the way to today. It's the small victories you achieve as you unearth one more small piece of a puzzle that leads you a step closer to figuring out what really happened all those years ago, right before everything turned to a nightmare. It's the hidden history just waiting to be discovered which, more often than not, connects back to a root of tragedy, vengeance, and cruelty, where the line between victims and perpetrators is frequently blurred and answers aren't always clear-cut. And thus, dear friends, my reasoning behind what makes a Mascot horror game scarily brilliant comes to an end. I want to reiterate that this is by no means some scientific study whose results are set in stone, but rather the opinion of a huge fan of the genre who has dedicated his life to the craft of storytelling and the search of what makes narrative experiences engaging. With that being said, I'm also curious to hear about your own takes on this topic. Do you agree with my argumentation, or do you have a different opinion on the matter? Feel free to comment below with your own theories of what makes a Mascot horror game terrifyingly awesome, as well as which games in the genre are your favorites. Until next time, stay spooky!